As the train whistle pierced the afternoon air, Josephine Greer clutched her worn leather suitcase tighter, her knuckles turning white with apprehension. The locomotive slowed to a halt at Willow Creek's dusty depot, billowing steam that momentarily obscured the small gathering of people waiting on the platform. This was it. Her new life was about to begin, thousands of miles from the crowded streets of Boston, where she'd spent all 22 years of her existence. The year was 1878, and like many young women facing limited prospects in the East, Josephine had answered an advertisement in the Matrimonial Gazette. After 3 months of correspondence with a cattle rancher named Theodore Blackwell, who sought a practical, God-fearing woman of good character to be his wife, she had sold what little she owned, said goodbye to the orphanage that had been her only home, and purchased a one-way ticket to Wyoming Territory. Josephine smoothed down her best blue dress, faded but clean, and pinched her cheeks for color as the conductor helped her descend onto the wooden platform. Her gaze scanned the small crowd, searching for the man who had described himself as 40 years of age, prosperous, with a substantial property requiring a woman's touch. She had memorized his letter, which promised she would want for nothing as his wife. "Mr. Blackwell?" she asked tentatively, approaching a stern-faced older man whose expensive suit and watch chain marked him as a man of means. The man looked her up and down with cold, assessing eyes. "You're the mail-order bride." His voice carried across the platform, causing several onlookers to turn and stare. Josephine nodded, fighting the heat rising to her cheeks. "Yes, sir, Josephine Greer. I believe you were expecting me." Theodore Blackwell's frown deepened as he circled her like a merchant inspecting questionable goods. "You're much smaller than I expected. How is a slip of a thing like you going to manage a household? And your hands," he grabbed her wrist, turning her palm upward. "These are not the hands of a woman who knows hard work." I'm stronger than I look, sir," Josephine stammered, pulling her hand away, "and I learn quickly." The advertisement specifically requested a woman with experience in household management, Blackwell continued, his voice rising. "Your letters claimed experience, but I can see now that was a falsehood." "I worked in the orphanage kitchen since I was 12, Josephine protested, her voice growing smaller with each word. "I can cook and clean and an orphan," Blackwell scoffed, taking a step back as if she were contagious. "That wasn't mentioned in your letters." "No family means no proper upbringing, no decent connections." He shook his head firmly. "This won't do at all. The arrangement is off." The blood drained from Josephine's face. But I've come all this way. I spent everything I had on the train ticket." "That's hardly my concern," Blackwell replied, already turning away. "Perhaps the saloon is hiring. A pretty face like yours would do well there." With a cold laugh, he strode toward a waiting carriage, leaving Josephine standing alone, her suitcase at her feet and the curious, pitying stares of strangers boring into her back. Tears welled in her eyes as the full weight of her situation crashed down. Alone in a strange town with no money, no connections, and nowhere to go. The train that had brought her had already departed, its whistle fading in the distance like her hopes for a new beginning. "Don't give that snake the satisfaction of seeing you cry," came a deep voice from beside her. Josephine turned to find a tall man with sun-bronzed skin watching her. His eyes were the clear blue of a summer sky, startling against his weathered face. Dust covered his worn leather vest and denims, and the wide-brimmed hat he held in his hands had seen many seasons of hard use. "Blackwell's reputation precedes him," the stranger continued. "You're the third bride he's rejected this year. Man enjoys the power of it, I reckon." Josephine hastily wiped her eyes with her gloved hand. "I don't know what I'm going to do now," she whispered, more to herself than to him. The cowboy studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of a day's worth of stubble. Then, to Josephine's surprise, he extended his hand. "Name's Yates Irving. I've got a small spread about 10 miles out of town," he said. "It ain't much compared to Blackwell's place, but there's work if you want it. Cooking for the hands, keeping the house. Proper work, not what Blackwell was suggesting." Josephine stared at his outstretched hand, suspicion warring with desperation. "Why would you help me, Mr. Irving?" "You don't know anything about me." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I know enough. I know Blackwell's a cold-hearted bastard who'd leave a woman stranded in strange territory, and I know my cook quit last week after burning down half my kitchen." He shrugged. "Consider it a business arrangement. Room, board, and fair wages for honest work." The station was emptying now, the onlookers losing interest in her plight and returning to their affairs. Josephine looked around at the unfamiliar dusty street, the saloon with its raucous laughter spilling out, the general store closing for the evening. What choice did she really have? "I'm a good cook," she said finally, her voice steadier. "And I don't burn kitchens." Yates Irving's smile widened, revealing a small dimple in his right cheek. "That's already an improvement." He picked up her suitcase with one hand and offered her the other. "My horse is tied up around back." Josephine hesitated only a moment longer before placing her gloved hand in his calloused one. His grip was firm and warm as he led her away from the platform where her dreams had just shattered, toward an uncertain future that somehow felt less frightening with each step. Behind the station, a magnificent chestnut stallion pawed at the ground impatiently. Irving secured her small suitcase to the saddle with practiced ease before turning to help her mount. "I've never ridden before," Josephine admitted, eyeing the tall horse with trepidation. "No time like the present to learn," Irving replied, his hands encircling her waist as he lifted her effortlessly onto the saddle. "Hold tight to the horn. Thunder here has gentle manners, especially with ladies." Once she was settled, Irving swung up behind her in one fluid motion. Josephine stiffened at the unexpected proximity, the solid warmth of his chest against her back, his arms reaching around her to take the reins. "Relax, Miss Greer," he said, his breath stirring the wisps of hair that had escaped her bonnet. "I promise you're safer with me than you would have been with Blackwell. That's not saying much, I know, but it's the truth all the same." As they rode out of town, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the rolling prairie, Josephine wondered if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life, or somehow stumbled onto the right path after all. Either way, there was no turning back now. The journey to Yates Irving's ranch took nearly 2 hours, giving Josephine plenty of time to observe the changing landscape. The town of Willow Creek gradually fell away behind them, replaced by vast expanses of prairie dotted with sagebrush, and the occasional stand of cottonwoods marking hidden water sources. In the distance, blue-purple mountains rose against the horizon, their peaks still capped with snow despite the late spring warmth. "Is it always this big?" Josephine asked, unable to keep the awe from her voice as she gazed at the seemingly endless terrain stretching in all directions. Irving's chuckle rumbled against her back. "The territory tends to make folks feel small at first. You'll get used to it." "I'm not sure anyone could get used to this much sky," she murmured. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves and the creak of leather creating a hypnotic cadence. As they crested a gentle rise, Irving pulled the horse to a stop. "There it is," he said, pointing toward a cluster of buildings nestled in a small valley. "The Double I Ranch." Josephine followed his gesture, taking in the modest but well-kept homestead below. A two-story house with a wraparound porch stood as the centerpiece, flanked by a large barn, several smaller outbuildings, and corrals containing horses and cattle. It wasn't grand by any means, but there was something inviting about the thin spiral of smoke rising from the chimney and the golden light of the setting sun glinting off the windows. "It's lovely," she said honestly, and felt rather than saw Irving smile. "Been in my family for 15 years, he replied, a note of pride in his voice. "My father staked the claim, built the house with his own hands, left it to me when he passed 5 years back." They continued down the slope, and as they drew closer, Josephine could see two men by the corral, one mending a section of fence while the other worked with a spirited young horse on a long lead line. "That's Hank and Emmett," Irving explained. "They work the ranch with me, along with Emmett's son Caleb, who's likely out checking the north pasture. Just 3 men for all this land." Josephine couldn't hide her surprise. "4 including me," Irving corrected. "It's a small operation compared to Blackwell's spread, but we manage. We run about 200 head of cattle, raise and train a few horses on the side. It's enough." As they rode into the yard, the men looked up, curiosity evident on their weathered faces. Irving dismounted first, then reached up to help Josephine down. Her legs trembled slightly after the long ride, and she was grateful for his steadying hand at her elbow. "Boys," Irving called out, "this here is Miss Josephine Greer. She's going to be taking over the cooking and keeping the house in order." The older of the 2 men, his face creased from years in the sun, touched the brim of his hat respectfully. "Madam, Hank Morris, pleased to meet you. Hope you know your way around a stove better than the last fella." "Don't set the bar too low, Hank," the younger man said with a grin as he approached. "A jackrabbit could cook better than Pete did." He extended his hand to Josephine. "Emmett Carter, Miss Greer. Welcome to the most beautiful, hard-working, underpaid outfit in the territory." Josephine shook his hand, finding herself smiling despite her exhaustion. "Thank you. I'll do my best to make sure you're well fed at least." "That's all we ask," Emmett replied with a wink. Irving cleared his throat. "Miss Greer's had a long journey. I'll show her to her quarters and give her a chance to rest before supper." He led Josephine toward the main house, carrying her suitcase as if it weighed nothing. The front door opened onto a simply furnished but clean living area with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A worn sofa and 2 armchairs clustered around a low table, while a larger table with 6 chairs occupied the dining space near a doorway that presumably led to the kitchen. "It ain't fancy," Irving said, watching her take in her surroundings, "but it's solid. Kitchen's through there, well stocked as of yesterday's supply run. Upstairs are the bedrooms. You'll have the small one at the end of the hall. It was my mother's sewing room, but we put a proper bed in there after Pete arrived." Josephine followed him up the narrow staircase to a hallway with 4 doors. He opened the last one, revealing a modestly sized room with a single bed, a small dresser, and a washstand. A colorful quilt covered the bed, and lace curtains adorned the window that looked out over the valley. "It's perfect," Josephine said, meaning it. After years in the orphanage's crowded dormitory, this small room felt like a palace in its privacy. Irving set her suitcase at the foot of the bed. "Bathroom's downstairs off the kitchen. We've got a pump inside for washing up, but for bathing, you'll need to heat water on the stove." He hesitated, then added, "The men and I usually bathe on Saturday nights, but I'll make sure you have your privacy whenever you need it." "Thank you, Mr. Irving." Josephine's voice was soft with gratitude. "For all of this. I don't know what I would have done if no need to dwell on that," he interrupted gently. "And it's just Yates. Mr. Irving was my father." "Yates," she repeated, testing the name. "Then you must call me Josephine." He nodded, his blue eyes warming slightly. "I'll leave you to get settled. Supper's usually at 7, but we can make do with whatever's on hand tonight if you're too tired to cook." "I'll manage something," Josephine assured him. "Cooking helps me think." After Yates left, gently closing the door behind him, Josephine sank onto the edge of the bed, the events of the day catching up with her in a rush. She'd been rejected, stranded, and rescued all within the span of a few hours. This wasn't at all how she'd imagined her arrival in Wyoming would go. She unpacked her few belongings: 3 dresses, undergarments, a nightgown, a hairbrush, and a small leather-bound Bible that had been her mother's, according to the orphanage director. At the bottom of her suitcase lay the letters from Theodore Blackwell, filled with promises that had turned to dust. Josephine considered burning them, then decided to save them as a reminder to be more cautious with her trust in the future. After washing her face and hands in the basin, and changing into her everyday dress, a practical brown cotton that wouldn't show dirt easily, Josephine made her way downstairs to examine the kitchen. It was larger than she expected, with a substantial iron stove, a sturdy wooden table for preparation, open shelving filled with staples, and a small pantry containing preserved goods. Despite Yates's claim that the cook had burned part of it down, everything looked in good order, if a bit disorganized. Inspired by the well-stocked pantry, Josephine set to work preparing a hearty beef stew with potatoes, carrots, and onions, along with a batch of buttermilk biscuits. The familiar routine of cooking soothed her frayed nerves, and by the time the ranch hands filed in for supper, the kitchen was filled with savory aromas. A 4th man had joined them: young Caleb, Emmett's son, who couldn't have been more than 18. He removed his hat upon seeing Josephine, revealing a shock of sun-bleached hair, and stammered a polite greeting before taking his seat at the table. The men fell upon the food with enthusiasm, a higher compliment than any words could have been. Between bites, they filled Josephine in on the ranch's routine: up before dawn, breakfast at 5:30, work until noon, a brief break for the midday meal, then back to work until sundown with supper at 7. Sundays were lighter days, with only essential chores done in time for rest or a trip into town if weather and work allowed. "Miss Greer, this stew would make a dead man hungry," Hank declared, helping himself to a 3rd serving. "Yates, you got lucky finding this one." "Don't I know it?" Yates replied, meeting Josephine's eyes across the table with a small smile. Later, after the dishes were washed and the men had retired to the porch to smoke, Josephine found herself alone in the kitchen with Yates. "Thank you for supper," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Best meal this house has seen in months." "It was nothing special," Josephine demurred, drying her hands on her apron. "Just simple food." "Sometimes simple is exactly what's needed." Yates studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Are you settling in all right? I know this isn't what you came to Wyoming for." Josephine considered his question carefully. "I came to Wyoming for a fresh start," she said finally. "This isn't the one I expected, but perhaps it's the one I needed." Yates nodded, seeming satisfied with her answer. "Well, we rise early here. You should get some rest." "Good night, Yates," Josephine said, folding her apron neatly. "Good night, Josephine," he replied, the sound of her name in his deep voice sending an unexpected warmth through her chest as she climbed the stairs to her room. That night, as Josephine lay in her new bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the prairie, the distant howl of coyotes, the soft nickering of horses in the barn, the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods, she reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought her here. She had come to Wyoming to be a wife, only to find herself a cook and housekeeper instead. Yet somehow, She couldn't bring herself to regret the change in plans. At least not yet. The next few weeks settled into a rhythm as Josephine found her place within the ranch's daily operations. She rose before the men each morning to stoke the stove and prepare a substantial breakfast: eggs, bacon or ham, biscuits or pancakes, strong coffee, all ready by the time they came in from their first round of chores. After they rode out for the day's work, she cleaned the house, tended the small kitchen garden that had been neglected in the former cook's tenure, and prepared bread and desserts for later meals. At noon, the men would return briefly for a simple lunch, then head back out until evening. Josephine used the afternoon hours to mend clothing, help Hank with the chickens he kept for eggs, and learn about the workings of the ranch whenever she could. By the time she prepared supper each evening, she was tired but satisfied with the work of her hands. Yates proved to be a fair employer. He paid her, as promised at the end of her first week, a sum that wasn't lavish, but was honest compensation for her labor. More than that, he treated her with a respect she hadn't always known in the orphanage, where she'd been just another mouth to feed, another pair of hands for work. She learned bits and pieces about him through observation and the occasional conversation when he lingered after meals. At 34, he'd been running the ranch alone since his father's death, expanding it gradually through hard work and careful management. Unlike many ranchers in the territory, he had good relations with the local Shoshone tribe, trading fairly for horses and occasionally employing young men from the reservation for seasonal work. "My father taught me that a man's word is his bond," Yates told her one evening as they sat on the porch after supper, the long summer twilight painting the valley in shades of gold and purple. "Doesn't matter if you're dealing with a banker in town or a Shoshone horse trader, you keep your promises and treat folks square." "A rare philosophy these days," Josephine remarked, thinking of Theodore Blackwell's broken promises. Yates's gaze shifted to her face, understanding in his eyes. "Blackwell's the type who thinks his money puts him above such considerations. Men like that leave a trail of damage behind them." "I was fortunate," Josephine said softly, "that you were there that day." Something flickered in Yates's expression, a momentary vulnerability quickly masked. "Fortune had little to do with it. I make a point of being in town when Blackwell's brides arrive." At her questioning look, he elaborated. "After the first one he rejected left her crying at the depot with nowhere to go, I decided to keep an eye out. The second girl, I helped her get a position as a schoolteacher over in Rawlins." Josephine stared at him, seeing him in a new light. "You've been rescuing Blackwell's discarded brides." Yates shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "Wouldn't call it rescuing. Just seemed the decent thing to do." "It was more than decent," Josephine insisted. "It was kind." The word hung between them in the deepening dusk, weighty with unspoken meaning. After a moment, Yates stood, breaking the spell of the moment. "Early start tomorrow," he said, his voice gruffer than usual. "We're moving cattle to the north pasture." As June melded into July, the Wyoming summer brought long, sun-drenched days and brief, star-filled nights. The work on the ranch intensified with the season cattle to be moved, hay to be cut and stored for winter, fences to be mended before the fall roundup. Josephine found herself increasingly involved in the ranch's operations, riding out occasionally with the noon meal when the men were working too far from the house to return. These excursions gave her a growing appreciation for the land that Yates and his men tended with such care. The Double I Ranch sprawled across rolling grasslands cut by a clear, fast-running creek that never ran dry, even in the height of summer. Stands of aspen and pine dotted the higher elevations, offering shade for cattle in the heat of midday. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that the crowded streets of Boston had never been. On one such ride in mid-July, Josephine delivered lunch to find the men hard at work, repairing a section of fence that had been damaged in a small prairie fire started by lightning. The sun beat down mercilessly as they worked, and Josephine was struck by the sight of Yates, shirtless in the heat, driving fence posts into the hard ground with powerful swings of a maul. Sweat gleamed on his bronzed skin, highlighting the play of muscles across his back and shoulders as he worked. She reined her horse to a stop, suddenly aware of a fluttering sensation in her stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. In the weeks she'd been at the ranch, she'd come to respect Yates as an employer and even count him as a friend of sorts. But this awareness of him as a man, a strong, handsome man whose presence made her pulse quicken, was new and unsettling. "Miss Josephine brings food," Caleb called out, spotting her first. The men gratefully set down their tools and gathered in the shade of a lone cottonwood where Josephine spread out the simple meal. She'd brought cold fried chicken, biscuits, pickled vegetables, and a jug of lemonade. Yates pulled his shirt back on before joining them, but the image of him working in the sun stayed with Josephine as they ate, causing her to lose the thread of conversation more than once. "You feeling all right, Miss Greer?" Hank asked, his weathered face concerned. "You're looking mighty flushed." "It's just the heat," Josephine replied quickly, avoiding Yates's gaze. "I'm still getting used to these Wyoming summers." "They can be brutal," Yates agreed, his voice neutral. "Maybe you should head back to the house before the sun gets any higher." Josephine nodded, packing up the remains of the meal. As she mounted her horse, a gentle mare named Daisy that Yates had been teaching her to ride, she felt his hand steady her elbow, the brief contact sending a jolt through her, even through the fabric of her sleeve. "Take it slow," he advised. "No need to rush in this heat." The concern in his voice warmed her more than the July sun as she rode back to the ranch house, confused by her own reaction. She'd come to Wyoming to be a wife, yes, but after Blackwell's rejection, she'd carefully locked away those expectations. This job with Yates was a godsend: stable, respectable work that allowed her to save money and consider her future options. Developing feelings for her employer would only complicate matters. Yet as the days passed, Josephine found it increasingly difficult to ignore the way her heart quickened when Yates entered a room, or how she looked forward to their quiet conversations on the porch after supper. She told herself it was merely gratitude and respect, but deep down, she recognized the dangerous truth: she was falling in love with Yates Irving. If Yates noticed her inner turmoil, he gave no sign. He remained unfailingly polite and considerate, but maintained a careful distance that Josephine couldn't help but interpret as a gentle reminder of their proper roles: employer and employee. Nothing more. Late July brought a trip into Willow Creek for supplies. Josephine had avoided town since her arrival, the memory of her humiliation at the depot still too fresh, but with harvest approaching and winter supplies needed, Yates asked if she would accompany him to select household goods. "You'll know better what we need for the kitchen," he explained. "And Mrs. Henderson at the general store has been curious about the Boston lady working at the Double I." Josephine agreed, spending extra time that morning arranging her hair and donning her best dress, the blue one she'd worn on her arrival, now carefully mended and pressed. When she descended the stairs to find Yates waiting in the front room, his usual ranch clothes replaced by a clean shirt, vest, and his least worn pair of denims, she was struck again by how handsome he was when he wasn't covered in dust and sweat. The wagon ride to town took less time than her journey on horseback had, but still afforded plenty of opportunity for conversation. Yates pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the area's early settlement, his deep voice painting pictures of a time barely 20 years past, when the only inhabitants had been the Shoshone and a few intrepid trappers. "My father came out in '63, right after getting wounded at Gettysburg," he told her. "Said he'd seen enough of war and wanted open spaces and honest work." "You didn't serve?" Josephine asked, realizing she knew little about his life before Wyoming. "I was just a boy 10 when the war ended," Yates replied. "By the time I was old enough, my father needed me here. Never did see much of the world beyond the territory." He glanced at her curiously. "Do you miss Boston?" Josephine considered the question. "I miss certain things, libraries, concerts, the bustle of the city. But Boston never really felt like home. The orphanage was adequate but institutional." "How long were you there?" Yates asked, his eyes on the road ahead but his attention clearly focused on her words. "Since I was 4, Josephine replied, the familiar ache of her childhood losses dulled by time but never completely gone. "My parents died in a tenement fire. I don't remember them much, just impressions really. My mother singing, my father's laugh." Yates was quiet for a moment. "That's why you came west, to find a new home?" "Yes," Josephine admitted. "When I saw Mr. Blackwell's advertisement, well, it seemed like Providence, a chance to belong somewhere to someone." The wagon hit a rut in the road, jostling them closer together momentarily. Yates steadied her with a hand on her arm, then withdrew it quickly, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "Blackwell's a fool," he said after a moment, his voice low and fierce. "Any man would be lucky to have a woman like you for a wife." The words hung in the air between them, charged with meaning that neither seemed ready to acknowledge. Josephine's heart pounded as she waited for him to say more, but Yates fell silent, his attention seemingly absorbed by guiding the team around a bend in the road. Willow Creek appeared before them, its main street busier than it had been on Josephine's arrival. Saturday was market day, Yates explained, when ranchers and farmers from the surrounding area came to town to trade and socialize. As they pulled up in front of Henderson's general store, Josephine steeled herself for curious stares and whispered comments. Word of her rejection at the depot had surely spread through the small community, and she dreaded facing the pity or scorn of strangers. To her surprise, Mrs. Henderson, a plump, energetic woman with iron-gray hair coiled in a neat bun, greeted her warmly as soon as they entered the store. "So you're the young lady who's got the double eye running smoothly again. Yates tells me your cooking has put 10 pounds on Hank Morris, which is a miracle in itself." "I wouldn't say that," Josephine demurred, but she was pleased by the friendly reception. "Don't be modest, dear. Good cooking is an art, and from what I hear, you're an artist." Mrs. Henderson lowered her voice conspiratorially. "And between us, you've done wonders for Yates. First time I've seen him in town 2 Saturdays in a month since his father passed." Josephine glanced at Yates, who was examining a display of tools with unusual intensity. The tips of his ears reddened in a way that had nothing to do with sun exposure. Shopping with Mrs. Henderson's enthusiastic assistance took the better part of an hour. By the time they finished, the wagon was loaded with flour, sugar, coffee, spices, new fabric for curtains, and various household necessities. Yates suggested lunch at the hotel dining room before heading back to the ranch, a treat that Josephine accepted eagerly, hungry after the morning's activities. The Willow Creek Hotel was the finest establishment in town, its dining room boasting tablecloths and actual china plates instead of the tin ones used at the cafe down the street. As Yates held her chair, Josephine was acutely aware of the glances directed their way from other diners. "People are staring," she murmured once they were seated. Yates shrugged, untroubled. Small town. They're just curious. About the mail-order bride who wasn't good enough for Theodore Blackwell, Josephine asked, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. About the woman who's brought the double I back to life, Yates corrected firmly. Don't give Blackwell more power than he deserves. Before Josephine could respond, a shadow fell across their table. She looked up to find Theodore Blackwell himself standing there, his cold eyes assessing her with the same disdain she remembered from their brief meeting at the depot. "Mr. Irving," Blackwell said, ignoring Josephine completely. "Bringing your housekeeper to town, I see." Yates's expression hardened, but his voice remained even. "Miss Greer is indeed in my employ, Blackwell. We're having lunch. Is there something you needed?" Blackwell's thin lips curved in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just being neighborly. I heard you'd taken in my reject." "Charitable of you." Josephine felt the blood drain from her face at the casual cruelty of his words. Across the table, she saw something dangerous flash in Yates's eyes as he slowly rose to his feet. "Apologize to the lady," Yates said quietly, his voice carrying an unmistakable edge. Blackwell raised an eyebrow. "Come now, Irving. We both know what she is. These mail-order women are desperate creatures willing to sell themselves." He never finished the sentence. Yates's fist connected with Blackwell's jaw in a swift, controlled motion that sent the older man staggering backward into an empty table. "I said, apologize to the lady," Yates repeated, his voice still quiet but vibrating with anger. Blackwell regained his balance, his hand going to his jaw. For a moment, Josephine thought he might retaliate, but something in Yates's stance seemed to give him pause. He straightened his jacket with exaggerated dignity. "You'll regret that, Irving," he said coldly. "No one strikes Theodore Blackwell without consequences." "I'd do it again in a heartbeat," Yates replied evenly. "Now get out before I forget there are ladies present." After Blackwell stormed out, the dining room erupted in hushed whispers. Yates sat back down, flexing his hands slightly, his expression troubled. "I'm sorry you had to witness that," he said to Josephine. "And sorrier that he spoke to you that way." "You didn't have to defend me," Josephine said softly, though her heart raced at the memory of his swift action on her behalf. "Yes, I did," Yates replied, his blue eyes meeting hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "I do a lot more than throw a punch to protect you, Josephine." The ride back to the ranch was quieter, both of them lost in thought after the confrontation with Blackwell. As they approached the Double I, the setting sun bathed the valley in golden light, turning the modest homestead into something from a painting. "It's beautiful," Josephine said, breaking the long silence. Yates followed her gaze, pride evident in his expression. "It is, isn't it? Not grand like Blackwell's place, but it's real, built with honest work, not schemes and sharp dealing." "I'd take it over a mansion any day," Josephine said honestly. Yates looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing past her surface to something deeper. "Would you?" he asked, his voice carrying a weight of meaning that made her heart skip. "Yes," she answered simply, holding his gaze. Something shifted between them in that moment, a barrier falling, a possibility opening. But before either could speak further, Emmett rode up to meet the wagon, his expression worried. "Boss, we've got trouble," he called. "3 calves missing from the east pasture, and Hank found tracks looks like rustlers." The moment broken, Yates switched immediately to the role of rancher, questioning Emmett about the details as they completed the drive to the house. Cattle rustling was a serious matter in Wyoming territory, where a man's livelihood depended on his herd. That evening, after a hastily eaten supper, Yates and his men prepared to ride out to track the rustlers. Josephine watched from the porch as they checked their weapons and saddled fresh horses, anxiety knotting her stomach. "Be careful," she said as Yates mounted his stallion, Thunder. He looked down at her, his expression softening momentarily. "We will. Don't worry, this isn't the first time we've dealt with rustlers." "That doesn't make it any less dangerous," Josephine replied, unable to hide her concern. Yates hesitated, then leaned down from the saddle, his voice low so that only she could hear. "I've got something worth coming back for now. I'll be careful." Before she could respond, he straightened and signaled to the men. They rode out into the gathering darkness, leaving Josephine standing on the porch, his words echoing in her mind and heart. The night stretched endlessly as Josephine waited for their return. She tried to keep busy cleaning the kitchen, preparing bread dough for the morning, mending one of Yates's shirts that had a torn sleeve, but her thoughts continually strayed to the men tracking rustlers in the dark. Wyoming nights could be dangerous even without the threat of armed thieves. Add in the possibility of confrontation, and her worry multiplied exponentially. Just after midnight, the sound of horses approaching brought her rushing to the door. Relief flooded through her at the sight of all 4 riders returning, apparently unharmed. As they dismounted, however, she noticed Yates favoring his left side. "What happened?" she demanded, hurrying down the porch steps. "Just a graze," Yates assured her, though his grimace as he dismounted told a different story. "We caught up to the rustlers near Black Rock Canyon. There was an exchange of gunfire. Did you recover the calves?" Josephine asked, helping him up the steps while the other men led the horses to the barn. "All 3, Yates confirmed. "And the sheriff's got 2 rustlers in custody. The third one got away, but he won't get far with a bullet in his leg." Inside, under the lamplight, Josephine could see that Yates's shirt was stained with blood along his left side. "Let me see," she insisted, helping him remove his jacket. "It's nothing serious," he protested, but allowed her to unbutton his shirt and examine the wound, a deep furrow across his ribs where a bullet had grazed him, leaving torn flesh, but fortunately no lodged bullet. "This needs cleaning," Josephine said firmly, falling back on the practical nursing skills she'd learned at the orphanage. "Sit down while I heat water." She worked efficiently, washing the wound with warm water and soap, then applying a poultice of herbs from Mrs. Henderson's medicinal supplies before bandaging it neatly. Throughout her ministrations, Yates remained silent, watching her face with an intensity that made her hands tremble slightly. "There," she said finally, securing the last of the bandage. "It should heal clean if you're careful not to reopen it." "Thank you," Yates said, his voice husky. His hand came up to capture hers where it rested on the bandage. "Josephine." Whatever he might have said was interrupted by the return of the other men. Josephine withdrew her hand and busied herself preparing coffee and sandwiches for them all, her cheeks warm with the memory of Yates's touch and the look in his eyes. The next morning, Josephine was up early as usual, despite having slept only a few hours. She found Yates already in the kitchen, attempting to lift the heavy coffee pot one-handed to avoid straining his injured side. "Let me do that," she scolded, taking it from him. "You're supposed to be resting that wound." "The ranch doesn't run itself," he replied, but there was no bite to his protest. "Besides, I've had worse." "That doesn't make this one any less painful," Josephine pointed out, pouring him a cup of coffee. Their fingers brushed as she handed him the mug, and neither pulled away immediately. The kitchen was quiet in the early dawn light, the rest of the house still asleep, creating a strange pocket of intimacy between them. "Josephine," Yates began again, setting down the coffee. "There's something I need to say to you." Her heart quickened at the serious note in his voice. "Yes. When I found you at the depot that day," he said slowly, choosing his words with care. "I told you it was a business arrangement, a job, and it was at first." Josephine held her breath, afraid to hope for what his next words might be. But these past weeks— Yates ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of uncharacteristic uncertainty. "You've become more than an employee to me, much more." "Yates," Josephine whispered, her voice catching. He stepped closer, his blue eyes intent on hers. "I know it hasn't been long. I know you came out here with different expectations, but I find myself wondering if maybe there could be something between us, something real." Josephine felt tears well in her eyes, not of sadness but of overwhelming emotion. "I've been wondering the same thing," she admitted softly. Yates's expression transformed, hope replacing uncertainty. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he raised his hand to cup her cheek. "I'm not a wealthy man like Blackwell. The double I is modest compared to his spread, but it's mine, free and clear, and I work it honestly." "I never wanted wealth," Josephine told him earnestly, leaning into his touch. "I wanted a home, someone to build a life with." "I can offer you that," Yates said, his thumb gently brushing a tear from her cheek. "If you'll have me." Instead of answering with words, Josephine rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but quickly deepened as Yates wrapped his arm around her waist, drawing her closer despite the twinge from his injured side. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "I take it that's a yes," he murmured, a smile in his voice. "Yes," Josephine confirmed, her heart so full she thought it might burst. 1,000 times yes. Their newfound understanding transformed the atmosphere at the Double I Ranch. Though Josephine continued her duties as cook and housekeeper, there was, after all, still work to be done. The nature of her relationship with Yates had fundamentally changed. Meals were punctuated by lingering glances and casual touches. Evenings on the porch became opportunities for shared confidences and tentative plans for the future. The men took the development in stride, with Hank declaring that it was about time, and Emmett good-naturedly suggesting they'd been dancing around each other since day one. Young Caleb seemed the most pleased of all, confiding to Josephine that he'd been afraid Yates would end up a lonely old bachelor like my Uncle Jed. August brought the haying season, with all hands working from dawn to dusk to cut, dry, and store enough fodder to see the cattle through the coming winter. Josephine expanded her role, riding out with the noon meal each day, and often staying to help where she could, raking hay into windrows, preparing beverages to combat the relentless heat, occasionally even driving the wagon that carried the baled hay back to the barn. On one such afternoon, as they worked side by side turning hay to dry in the sun, Yates broached the subject that had been hovering between them. "Preacher Collins comes through Willow Creek next Sunday," he said casually, his pitchfork rhythmically turning the sweet-smelling hay. "He only makes it out this way once a month." Josephine paused in her work, her heart skipping. "Does he now?" Yates confirmed, not looking at her directly. "Thought maybe we could ride into town, attend the service." "That would be nice," Josephine agreed, fighting a smile at his roundabout approach. Yates cleared his throat. "Maybe see him afterward about other business he might conduct." "Other business?" Josephine prompted innocently, enjoying his uncharacteristic awkwardness. Yates finally stopped working and turned to face her fully, his expression exasperated but fond. "Josephine Greer, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Properly, with a preacher and witnesses and whatever else you want to make it official." Josephine's teasing smile softened into something more genuine. "Yes, Yates Irving, I will absolutely marry you." He kissed her then, in the middle of the hayfield under the vast Wyoming sky, his lips tasting of sunshine and promises. The wedding plans were necessarily simple given the remote location and short timeline. Mrs. Henderson from the general store took charge of helping Josephine prepare, insisting on ordering special fabric from Cheyenne for a wedding dress and organizing a small reception at the hotel after the ceremony. "Every bride deserves some fuss made over her," she declared when Josephine protested that a simple ceremony would suffice. "Besides, this town could use a happy occasion to gossip about instead of cattle prices and who's feuding with whom." On the morning of the wedding, Josephine woke in her small room at the Double I for the last time. That evening, she would return as Yates's wife, moving into the master bedroom that had stood largely unused since his father's death. The thought sent a flutter of nervous anticipation through her stomach, not fear, but the natural anxiety of crossing such a significant threshold. A knock at her door revealed Mrs. Henderson and two other women from town who had ridden out to help her prepare. They descended upon her with good-natured efficiency, helping her bathe and dress, arranging her hair in an elegant style adorned with small white flowers, and finally presenting her with the completed wedding dress, a creation of ivory silk with delicate lace trim that made Josephine gasp when she saw her reflection in the mirror. "You look beautiful, dear," Mrs. Henderson said, dabbing at her eyes. "Yates won't know what hit him." Downstairs, Yates and the ranch hands were similarly preparing, though with considerably less fuss. Emmett had been dispatched to ensure that Yates didn't catch a glimpse of his bride before the ceremony. Bad luck, according to Mrs. Henderson, though Josephine suspected it had more to do with preserving the surprise of her appearance. The wagon ride to town was filled with nervous excitement. Josephine sat between Mrs. Henderson and her friend Mrs. Collins, no relation to the preacher, a shawl draped over her wedding dress to protect it from dust. The women chattered about weddings past and offered increasingly specific advice about married life that made Josephine's cheeks burn, though she filed away certain suggestions for future reference. Willow Creek's small church was packed when they arrived. Word of the wedding had spread throughout the surrounding ranches and farms, bringing in folks who rarely made the journey to town, except for special occasions. As Mrs. Henderson helped Josephine down from the wagon behind the church, keeping her hidden from the guests already filing inside, Josephine was struck by how many people had come to witness her marriage to a man she'd known for barely 2 months. "Everyone loves Yates," Mrs. Henderson explained, noting her surprise. "His father before him, too. The Irving men have always been good neighbors, first to help in hard times, fair in their dealings, and they're curious about you, of course." The Boston lady who captured the most eligible bachelor in the county. Inside the church, Emmett was waiting to escort her down the aisle in lieu of a father. He whistled low when he saw her. "Miss Greer, Josephine, you look like an angel. Yates is the luckiest man in Wyoming territory." The small church had been transformed with wildflowers and ribbons. As the congregation rose and turned to watch her entrance, Josephine's eyes sought and found Yates standing at the altar beside Preacher Collins. The look on his face as he saw her, wonder, joy, love, was everything she could have hoped for and more. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of emotion. Josephine remembered the warmth of Yates's hands holding hers, the sincerity in his voice as he repeated the vows, the gentle way he slid a simple gold band onto her finger, a ring that had belonged to his mother, he told her later. When Preacher Collins pronounced them man and wife, Yates's kiss was both tender and possessive, drawing good-natured cheers from the assembled guests. The reception at the Willow Creek Hotel was a lively affair, with music provided by a local fiddler and his sons, dancing in the cleared dining room, and enough food to feed twice the number of guests. Josephine found herself whirled from one dance partner to another, as the men of the community welcomed her into their circle, from ancient Mr. Finch, who had been among the first settlers in the area, to young ranch hands barely older than Caleb, to the sheriff himself, who assured her that Yates was one of the good ones. Throughout it all, she was aware of Yates's eyes following her, his smile when their gazes met across the room, the way he reclaimed her for every other dance with a possessiveness that thrilled her. This was her husband, the words still new and wonderful in her mind, and the life they would build together stretched before them like the vast Wyoming horizon, full of promise. As the celebration continued into the evening, Yates eventually pulled her aside into a quiet corner. "Had enough of sharing you," he murmured against her ear, his breath warm on her skin. "What do you say we make our escape?" Josephine nodded, suddenly eager to be alone with him, to begin the private celebration of their union. They slipped away with minimal fanfare, despite Mrs. Henderson's knowing wink and Hank's slightly too loud blessing for many little Irvings to run the double I someday. The ride back to the ranch was different from any they had shared before, charged with anticipation, yet comfortable in their new certainty of belonging to each other. Yates had arranged for the house to be empty. The men would stay in town for the night, giving the newlyweds privacy for their first evening as husband and wife. As they approached the homestead, silhouetted against the twilight sky, Yates reined in the horses. "Welcome home, Mrs. Irving," he said softly, the words carrying a weight of meaning that brought tears to Josephine's eyes. "Home," she repeated, the words sweet on her tongue. After a lifetime of belonging nowhere and to no one, she had found both a place and a person to call her own. At the house, Yates insisted on carrying her over the threshold for luck. He explained with a smile that suggested he needed no excuse to hold her in his arms. Inside, she found that someone, probably Mrs. Henderson, had been busy in their absence. The house was spotless, with fresh flowers on the table and new curtains at the windows. A bottle of champagne, a rare luxury in Wyoming territory, sat cooling in a bucket of water drawn from the well. "I thought we might want to celebrate properly," Yates said, following her gaze to the champagne. "Mrs. Henderson ordered it special from Cheyenne when she heard we were getting married. Said every bride deserves a little elegance on her wedding night." "She's been very kind," Josephine said, touched by the thoughtfulness of a woman who had been a stranger just weeks ago. "People here look after their own," Yates replied, uncorking the champagne with practiced ease and pouring 2 glasses. "And you're one of us now." They toasted their marriage, sipping the unfamiliar bubbly wine that tickled Josephine's nose and warmed her blood. As the night deepened around them, their conversation dwindled, replaced by touches and glances that spoke more eloquently than words. When Yates finally took her hand and led her upstairs to what was now their bedroom, Josephine went willingly, her initial nervousness overshadowed by trust and desire. The room had been transformed as well: fresh linens on the bed, a vase of wildflowers on the dresser, candles casting a warm, golden glow over everything. "Are you nervous?" Yates asked, his hands gentle on her shoulders as he helped her remove the pins from her hair. "A little," Josephine admitted. "But not afraid." "Never be afraid with me," he said, his voice a low promise as he bent to kiss her neck, sending shivers down her spine. "I'll always take care of you, Josephine, always." That night, Josephine discovered the final piece of the puzzle that had brought her across the country in search of a new life. In Yates's arms, she found not just physical pleasure but a deeper connection, the certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with the man she was meant to love. As summer gave way to fall, Josephine settled fully into her role as Yates's wife and mistress of the Double I Ranch. The transition from employee to spouse was smoother than she might have expected, aided by the genuine respect and affection that had marked their relationship from the beginning. The ranch work intensified with the approaching winter. September brought the fall roundup, when cattle that had grazed the high summer pastures were brought down to lower elevations for the cold months ahead. Josephine rode out with the men more frequently now, learning the boundaries of the Double I's land and developing a surprisingly strong affinity for horseback riding. "You're a natural," Yates told her proudly as they rode the fence line one crisp October morning, checking for brakes that needed repair before the first snows. "Most city folks take years to get comfortable in the saddle, if they ever do." "I had a good teacher," Josephine replied with a smile, patting Daisy's neck affectionately. The mare had become her constant companion on these excursions, proving as steady and reliable as Yates himself. Their marriage had quickly developed a comfortable rhythm, working side by side during the day, sharing quiet evenings by the fire, and nights of tender passion that deepened their bond. Josephine had never imagined she could be so happy, so content in a life so different from the one she had expected. The only shadow on their happiness came from Theodore Blackwell. True to his threat in the hotel dining room, he seemed determined to make trouble for the Double I. Nothing overt at first, just small irritations like his cattle accidentally breaking through fences to graze on Double I land, or his men coincidentally choosing the same days as Yates to conduct business in town, causing delays and inconvenience. But as November approached, the harassment escalated. A section of fence was found cut, allowing a dozen of Yates's best cattle to wander onto open range where rustlers could easily take them. A storage shed containing winter feed was mysteriously burned one night, though fortunately discovered before the fire could spread to the barn or house. "It's Blackwell," Yates said grimly after they'd extinguished the flames. "No proof. Of course he's too smart for that, but I know it's him." "But why?" Josephine asked, bewildered by such determined malice. "Surely not just because you struck him that day in town," Yates sighed, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "It goes back further than that. My father and Blackwell had a long-standing feud over water rights to Cottonwood Creek. Dad won in court, fair and square, but Blackwell never forgave him. When Dad died, Blackwell tried to pressure me into selling the Double I to him, offered a fair price. I'll give him that, but this land is my heritage. I wouldn't sell at any price. And then you embarrassed him publicly," Josephine added, understanding dawning, "both by striking him and by marrying the woman he rejected," Yates finished, his expression softening as he looked at her. "I'd do it all again in a heartbeat, Josephine. Don't doubt that for a second." "I don't," she assured him. "But I'm worried about what he might do next. These incidents keep escalating." Yates pulled her into his arms, his embrace solid and reassuring. "We'll be careful. Increase the night patrols. Keep the men in pairs when they're working far from the house. Blackwell's the type to hire others to do his dirty work. He won't risk getting his own hands dirty." Despite these precautions, Josephine couldn't shake her uneasiness. She began to accompany Yates more frequently on his rides around the property, unwilling to let him go alone despite his assurances that he could handle himself. It was on one such ride in mid-November that her fears were realized. They had separated briefly, Yates riding ahead to check a spring that had been running low, Josephine pausing to gather the last of the wild rosehips for preserves. The crack of a rifle shot echoed across the valley, followed by the thunder of hooves and a shout that Josephine recognized immediately as Yates's voice. Heart in her throat, she spurred Daisy toward the sound, cresting a small rise to find a scene of chaos below. Yates was on foot, his horse nowhere to be seen, exchanging gunfire with two mounted men while seeking cover behind a large boulder. Even as she watched, one of the attackers wheeled his horse and galloped away, but the other continued firing, pinning Yates down. Without thinking, Josephine urged Daisy forward, screaming at the top of her lungs to create a distraction. The strategy worked. The attacker turned at the sound, momentarily confused by the sight of a woman bearing down on him. In that instant of hesitation, Yates fired, his shot finding its mark. The man slumped in his saddle, then toppled to the ground as his horse shied away. "Josephine!" Yates shouted, his voice rough with fear. "Stay back!" But she was already dismounting, running to him with her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. "Are you hurt?" "I heard shots. I'm fine," he assured her, though a quick inspection revealed a bloody graze along his arm similar to the one he'd received during the Rustler incident. "What were you thinking, riding in like that? He could have shot you." "He was going to shoot you," Josephine retorted, tears of relief and fear stinging her eyes. "I couldn't just hide and watch it happen." Yates's expression shifted from anger to something closer to wonder. He pulled her against him with his uninjured arm, holding her tightly. "Brave, foolish woman," he murmured into her hair. "What would I do without you?" After ensuring the attacker was indeed dead, a rough-looking man Josephine had never seen before, they recovered Yates's horse, which had bolted at the first gunshot but hadn't gone far. With the body secured across the saddle, they rode back to the ranch to alert the sheriff. The investigation that followed confirmed what they already suspected. The dead man was a known gun for hire who had been seen in Blackwell's company several times in recent weeks. The second man, who had escaped, was likely his partner. However, without direct evidence linking Blackwell to the attempted murder, the sheriff could do little beyond warning the rancher that he was watching him closely. "It's his word against ours," Yates explained to Josephine that evening as she rebandaged his arm. "And Blackwell has powerful friends in the territorial government. So he just gets away with trying to kill you?" Josephine demanded, anger lending heat to her words. "For now," Yates conceded. "But men like Blackwell eventually overreach. He'll make a mistake, and when he does, we'll be ready." The attack changed something in their relationship. The tangible threat to Yates's life had brought home to Josephine just how precious their time together was, how easily it could be snatched away. She found herself treasuring each moment more intensely, memorizing the small details that made up their shared life, the way Yates hummed tunelessly while he worked, the crinkles at the corners of his eyes when he smiled, the feeling of his arms around her in the quiet darkness before dawn. As winter settled over the Double I Ranch, blanketing the valley in snow and confining their activities more to the house and nearby buildings, Josephine began to suspect that their family might soon be growing. Her monthly courses, regular as clockwork since she was 15, had failed to appear. Morning sickness plagued her, though she managed to hide it from Yates initially, rising before him to deal with the worst of it privately. It was Mrs. Henderson who confirmed her suspicions during a pre-Christmas visit to town. The older woman took one look at Josephine's slightly green complexion as they passed the butcher shop and smiled knowingly. "When are you due, dear?" she asked without preamble as they examined fabric for Christmas gifts. Josephine started, nearly dropping the bolt of flannel she was holding. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's had 5 children of her own," Mrs. Henderson assured her. "Have you told Yates yet?" "No," Josephine admitted. "I wanted to be certain first, and I was waiting for the right moment." The older woman patted her hand. "Christmas is coming. I can't think of a better gift for a man like Yates then the news he's going to be a father. Taking Mrs. Henderson's advice, Josephine planned a special Christmas Eve dinner for just the two of them. The ranch hands had been given the night off to celebrate in town, leaving the house quiet and intimate. She prepared all of Yates's favorite dishes, set the table with their best linens, and even arranged for a small pine tree in the corner of the living room, decorated with paper stars and strings of dried berries. When Yates returned from his afternoon chores, his face lit up at the sight of the transformed house. "What's all this?" he asked, hanging his coat by the door. "Christmas Eve," Josephine replied simply, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "I thought we deserved a celebration, just the two of us." Dinner was a leisurely affair, with conversation flowing as easily as it had since their early days together. After they'd finished eating, Josephine brought out the small gift she'd prepared, a hand-knitted scarf in a deep blue that matched his eyes. "It's beautiful," Yates said, wrapping it around his neck immediately despite the warmth of the house. "Perfect for these Wyoming winters." He reached into his pocket and produced a small package of his own. "I have something for you, too." Inside the brown paper wrapping, Josephine found a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. When she opened it, she discovered a tiny photograph of Yates on one side, the other empty. "I thought maybe someday we could put a family portrait in the other half," Yates explained, a hint of shyness in his voice that was utterly endearing from such a confident man. "For you to keep close to your heart." Josephine felt tears well in her eyes at the perfect opening he'd given her. "We might need that family portrait sooner than you think," she said softly. Yates looked at her blankly for a moment before understanding dawned in his eyes. "Josephine," he breathed, "are you saying what I think you're saying?" She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat as she watched joy transform his face. In an instant, he was out of his chair and kneeling beside hers, his hands gentle on her still flat stomach. "A baby," he whispered, awe in his voice. "Our baby." "Due in early summer, I think," Josephine confirmed, covering his hands with hers. "Are you happy?" "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Yates replied, rising to kiss her with such tenderness that fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "You've given me everything, Josephine. Everything I never knew I needed, until you stepped off that train." The news of Josephine's pregnancy spread quickly through the small community, bringing a flurry of well wishes and practical gifts: baby clothes, a handmade cradle from Hank, who proved surprisingly skilled with woodworking, herbal remedies for morning sickness from Mrs. Henderson. Even young Caleb shyly presented her with a small carved horse for the baby to play with when he's big enough. "Or she," Josephine corrected gently. "It might be a girl." Caleb considered this possibility with all the seriousness of his 18 years. "A girl would be nice too," he decided. "She could grow up to be strong and brave like you, Mrs. Irving." The winter passed in a haze of contentment despite the continuing tensions with Blackwell. There were no more direct attacks, perhaps because the failed assassination attempt had drawn too much attention. But minor harassments continued: cattle driven onto Double I land to consume scarce winter feed. Rumors spread in town questioning the ranch's financial stability. Attempts to hire away Yates's loyal hands with promises of higher wages. "He's trying to wear us down," Yates observed grimly one February evening as they sat by the fire, Josephine knitting tiny garments for the baby while he reviewed the ranch accounts. "Make running the Double I so difficult that we'll give up and sell." "He doesn't know who he's dealing with," Josephine replied, her voice steady with conviction. "We're not giving up our home. Not now, not ever." Yates looked up from his ledger, his expression softening as it always did when he looked at her. "No, we're not," he agreed. "This land will go to our children, and their children after them. Blackwell can plot all he wants, but the double I stays in Irving hands. As spring slowly returned to the valley, bringing new grass and calves, Josephine's condition became increasingly obvious. Yates grew more protective, insisting she ride less and rest more, though she continued to manage the household and help with lighter ranch work until her advancing pregnancy made it impractical. It was during a rare visit to town in late April that the situation with Blackwell finally came to a head. Josephine had accompanied Yates to purchase supplies and visit the doctor, who had recently moved to Willow Creek from Denver and was the closest thing to proper medical care available for her upcoming delivery. As they loaded their purchases into the wagon, Theodore Blackwell approached, his cold eyes taking in Josephine's prominent belly with calculated malice. "Irving," he acknowledged with a curt nod. "Mrs. Irving, I see congratulations are in order." "Thank you," Josephine replied stiffly, one hand instinctively moving to protect her unborn child. "I've been meaning to speak with you," Blackwell continued, addressing Yates directly. "I'm willing to renew my offer for the double I, given your expanding family responsibilities. You might find a cash settlement more appealing now." Yates's jaw tightened. "The ranch isn't for sale, Blackwell. Not now, not ever." "Reconsider," Blackwell urged, his voice hardening. "Wyoming territory is a dangerous place for a young family. Accidents happen. Illness strikes. How would your wife and child manage if something happened to you?" The thinly veiled threat hung in the air between them. Josephine felt a chill despite the warm spring day, but Yates remained steady beside her. "Is that a threat, Blackwell?" he asked quietly. "Merely an observation," the older man replied smoothly. "Life is uncertain. A prudent man plans for all contingencies." Before Yates could respond, the sheriff appeared from the direction of his office. "Everything all right here?" he asked, his gaze shifting between the two men with obvious awareness of the tension. "Just a business discussion," Blackwell said, tipping his hat. "Good day, Sheriff. Mr. Irving, Mrs. Irving." With a final cold smile, he turned and walked away. "Man doesn't know when to quit," the sheriff observed once Blackwell was out of earshot. "I'd watch your back, Yates. He's been drinking heavily since you married the lady he rejected, and drunk men make poor decisions." "We're being careful," Yates assured him, helping Josephine up onto the wagon seat. "But I appreciate the warning." As they drove home, Josephine broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "What if he doesn't stop, Yates? What if he keeps escalating, with the baby coming?" Yates covered her hand with his own, his grip reassuring. "I won't let anything happen to you or our child, Josephine. I promise you that." She believed him, had absolute faith in his determination to protect them, but Blackwell's resources and influence were considerable. The thought of raising their child under such a persistent threat cast a shadow over her anticipation of motherhood. That night, after they had retired to their bedroom, Yates pulled her close against him, his hand gently caressing the swell of her stomach where their child grew. "I've been thinking," he said quietly into the darkness. "Maybe it's time to take a more direct approach with Blackwell." Josephine turned in his arms to face him, though she could barely make out his features in the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains. "What do you mean?" "I mean I'm tired of being on the defensive," Yates explained. "Waiting for his next move, always looking over my shoulder. It's no way to live, especially with a child on the way." "What are you suggesting?" Josephine asked, a note of apprehension in her voice. "Nothing illegal," he assured her quickly. "But Blackwell's not the only one with connections in the territory. I've been corresponding with a friend who works for the land office in Cheyenne. Turns out there are some irregularities in how Blackwell acquired portions of his ranch." "Irregularities," Josephine repeated, intrigued despite her concerns. Forged documents, intimidated sellers, possibly even fraud against the government itself, Yates elaborated. My friend thinks there's enough evidence to bring formal charges, maybe even force Blackwell to relinquish some of his holdings. Josephine considered this new information carefully. It would be risky, she said finally. Blackwell would know it was you behind the investigation. He already blames me for every misfortune in his life, Yates pointed out wryly. At least this way, we might put an end to his harassment once and for all. In the end, they agreed that Yates would continue gathering evidence but take no action until after the baby was born. One battle at a time, he conceded, kissing her forehead tenderly. For now, bringing our child safely into the world is all that matters. May brought warming temperatures and the final preparations for the baby's arrival. The small room adjacent to their bedroom was transformed into a nursery, with the cradle Hank had made taking pride of place by the window. Josephine found herself nesting, instinctively organizing linens, preserving early fruits, ensuring that the household would run smoothly even if she was temporarily unable to manage it herself. On a bright morning in early June, just as the first wildflowers were beginning to carpet the meadows around the Double I, Josephine's labor began. Yates sent Caleb racing to town to fetch both Mrs. Henderson, who had assisted at dozens of births over the years, and the new doctor if he was available. The labor was long but uncomplicated, with Josephine drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Yates refused to leave her side despite Mrs. Henderson's initial protests that the birthing room was no place for a man. "My wife needs me," he said simply, taking Josephine's hand as another contraction gripped her. "I'm staying." As the sun began to set, painting the valley in hues of gold and crimson, their daughter entered the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to Yates's eyes. The doctor, who had arrived midway through the labor, pronounced both mother and child perfectly healthy as he placed the swaddled infant in Josephine's arms. "She's beautiful," Yates whispered, one finger gently tracing the perfect curve of their daughter's cheek, "just like her mother." They named her Elizabeth Hope Irving Elizabeth after Yates's mother, and hope for what she represented to both of them. The promise of a future built on love and perseverance. The weeks following Elizabeth's birth were a blur of adjustment as they settled into their new roles as parents. Josephine discovered that all her experience caring for younger children at the orphanage had only partially prepared her for the all-consuming nature of motherhood. Yet even the sleepless nights and constant demands of a newborn couldn't dim the joy she felt each time she looked at her daughter's face or felt the tiny weight of her in her arms. Yates proved to be a devoted father, often carrying Elizabeth against his chest in a sling Mrs. Henderson had fashioned while he worked around the ranch house, crooning old cowboy songs that made the baby stare up at him with wide, solemn eyes. "She recognizes your voice," Josephine observed one evening as Elizabeth quieted immediately when Yates began speaking. "She knows her father." "Smart girl," Yates replied with a grin, gently rocking their daughter to sleep. "Takes after her mother." As summer progressed and Josephine regained her strength, the matter of Theodore Blackwell resurfaced. The evidence Yates had been gathering through his contact at the land office had grown substantial enough to warrant formal action. In late July, a federal marshal arrived from Cheyenne to investigate the allegations of fraud and intimidation, spending several days interviewing landowners throughout the county, including Yates. The investigation sent shockwaves through the community. Blackwell, once feared for his wealth and influence, suddenly found former allies distancing themselves as details of his questionable business practices came to light. When the marshal departed with promises to return with formal charges, there was a palpable sense that the balance of power had shifted. "You did it," Josephine marveled as they watched the marshal's dust trail disappear down the road. "You found a way to fight back without stooping to his level." "We did it," Yates corrected, his arm around her waist. "I wouldn't have had the courage to take on Blackwell without knowing what I was fighting for you and Elizabeth, our future together." The federal case against Blackwell proceeded slowly but inexorably through the territorial courts. By the time snow once again blanketed the Double I Ranch, Theodore Blackwell had been indicted on multiple counts of fraud, forced to relinquish significant portions of his holdings, and fined so heavily that he was compelled to sell most of his remaining property to cover the penalties. "He's finished in Wyoming," the sheriff informed them during a December visit to the ranch. "Word is he's headed back east with what little he has left. Too many enemies here now. Too many people willing to testify against him if he causes any more trouble." The news brought a sense of closure and relief that made that second Christmas as husband and wife even more joyous than the first. With Elizabeth, now 6 months old and beginning to sit up on her own, cradled between them before the fire, Yates and Josephine reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. "If Blackwell hadn't rejected me at the depot that day," Josephine mused, watching the firelight play across their daughter's delighted face, "none of this would have happened. I might be living in that cold mansion of his, miserable but trapped." "I like to think we would have found each other somehow," Yates replied, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Some things are just meant to be." As they sat together in the warmth of the home they'd built, surrounded by the love they'd found against all odds, Josephine had to agree. From the moment Yates had extended his hand to her on that dusty train platform, they had been walking a path that led inevitably to this, not wealth or grandeur, but something infinitely more valuable: a life rich in love, purpose, and belonging. Outside, snow fell gently over the Double I Ranch, blanketing the land that would pass to Elizabeth and the brothers or sisters that might follow her in the years to come. Inside, before the crackling fire, a family that had begun with a rejected mail-order bride and the cowboy who saw her worth celebrated the greatest gift of all, the home they had created together, built not of wood and stone but of courage, forgiveness, and abiding love.